Hello and welcome to the second of our Good Relations lecture series. Today we're going to be talking about UN 1325 and peace building, and we're going to explain in detail what 1325 means in theory and in practice, and we're going to look at how it applies to our situation here in Northern Ireland. So the first question is, what is UN 1325? It's one of those things that you might have heard mentioned that is sometimes talked about, perhaps in the news and perhaps in conferences and so on, and that often isn't explained in detail. So today we're going to go through in detail what it is all about, what the purpose of it is, how it works, and we're going to look, like I said, at how it works here in Northern Ireland. So 1325 it's not a very accessible name. It immediately puts people off, but it is simply the number associated with the resolution that it is. It's a UN resolution, which means it was discussed and accepted by the Security Council of the United Nations, by countries from all around the world and their representatives at the United Nations. So it's a resolution, like I said, which means it's a principle that they've accepted. It doesn't have the power to pass laws or to change international situations. It's really more a principle that is supposed to be applied to peace processes as they happen. It was passed pledging to work on the disproportionate impact of war and conflict on women and girls, and to involve women and girls in peace resolution processes after war and in the ongoing periods after a conflict where it takes a while to really build peace. And the reason we use the phrase peace building as opposed to peacemaking, it sounds like it's just a small quibble, but it's really important, because the idea is peace is much more than having all of the delegates sign on to a document and to affirm their commitment to peace. It's much more than that. It's actually making sure that the peace penetrates all the way through society, so that it isn't just a piece of paper with some names on it. It's a real way of living, and that in fact the whole of the society embraces peace, and that peace is evident in all parts of the society, and that the conflict itself becomes resolved in a genuine way. So according to the document, it, and this is a quote, affirms that peace and security efforts are more sustainable when women are equal partners in the prevention of violent conflict, the delivery of relief and recovery efforts, and in the forging of lasting peace. So over the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to break down what that really means in practice. There are 4 pillars to UN 1325, and we're going to explore all of those as well. And those are participation, prevention, protection, and relief and recovery. And hopefully when we speak through all of these, it'll be clear what the purpose of this is. So the first question really is, how did 1325 come about? And it's very important to talk about this, because we need to understand that at the United Nations, just like everywhere else, these things weren't gifted to women. They were the result of a period of sometimes centuries, decades of campaigning to get them included. And this is something that will ring true for anybody who knows a little bit about, I suppose, women's history. It doesn't usually get gifted to us. Everything that we've won, we've had to fight for. And that includes things like the right to vote. So there's a very long history of women bringing issues of peace and security to the world stage. This goes back as far as World War I, in fact, before World War I. In 1914, there was the International Congress of Women for a Permanent Peace. And this included representatives from many countries across Europe and beyond, including the United States and Canada, who formed this Congress of women who were pushing for peace in The Hague in the Netherlands. This was before the International Criminal Court was in The Hague, but it was nonetheless, it was a sort of a central point in Europe to bring these issues to. And like I say, women from all around the world sent representatives there. And they discussed and they brought together documents about how war disproportionately impacts women, about how women are more likely to be involved in peace building on a local level, and how important it is to have those voices and those issues reflected on the world stage. Because what those women saw was in the run up to war itself, which hadn't been declared yet, but was very much likely to happen, what they saw was decisions being made by men who often had a very hands-off approach to the actual men who would be fighting and dying in the war that was to come. And they saw these men as more or less playing chess rather than really engaged in what war would mean on the ground for the people fighting it and the people who fell victim to it. Now, of course, in 1914, none of these women had the right to vote. Most of them came from countries where no women had ever represented never been elected representatives or anything like that. It was very much a case of easy to ignore. And in fact, it was more or less ignored, and war, of course, did happen. And although it was spoken of as the war to end all wars, we all know better. We all know that that isn't really what happened. And so it was relatively easy for the international politicians to ignore women at that point in time. But that became more and more difficult as women gained the right to vote, as more women started to be elected. They started to be able to raise these issues with their contemporaries rather than speaking up to people who were considered to be sort of above them. So the United Nations was formed after World War II, and its purpose from the beginning was to prevent an international conflict of that scale ever happening again. The idea was it would make a commitment to work for peace, and that by including as many nations as possible in the United Nations and in the work that they do, it would be easier to have that peace filter down to the general populations as well, so that not only would war not happen between countries that are signed up to the United Nations, but also in general, peace building would be a sort of core plank of what the United Nations was all about. That also, of course, hasn't really panned out, but over the period of time since the United Nations was formed, other conflicts have happened, but they've not been traditional conflicts in the mold of World War I, World War II, and before that. And that changing nature of conflict has really given an impetus to these women who were campaigning all along to focus on how these new conflicts even more disproportionately impact women than conflicts before that had done. So from about 1975, the United Nations began to look seriously at the role of women in peace and security. And this is what we call the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. It's an awful lot of jargon sometimes, but it's easily understood when you see how it came about. So from about 1975, they started to hold conferences, world conferences, which were aimed at elevating gender equality on the global stage. And their understanding was if we have more gender equality internationally as well as domestically, we're less likely to have war. So on some level, they were accepting the basic principle of those women from the International Congress for Women for a Permanent Peace. But also at the same time, it was almost like a side event to the main purpose of what the United Nations was about. And it took some work, some decades, to get it to be central rather than a side event. In 1995, the Beijing Declaration took place, which led on to the formation of the Coalition on Women and International Peace and Security. Again, these are an awful lot of names and don't feel like you need to know them all, but it's just really to show the slow progress, but steady progress that these women were making. And that coalition became the main lobbying force for what we now know as 1325. And they spent decades really talking about the impact of war on women and what women can bring to the peacemaking table for a long time before it became formalized in 1325. And it's important to remember at this point that Namibia was the chair of the UN Security Council. It rotates between the different countries who all sit on the Security Council. At the time of 1325, in the year 2000, so it's just had its 20th birthday, Namibia was the chair, and they really wanted to push for this to be adopted, because it was something that they had seen bore fruit in their own domestic situation. So the Security Council unanimously acknowledged in accepting 1325 two things: the changing nature of warfare, and that goes back to what I mentioned. We haven't had an international conflict on the scale of World War II since World War II. And let's hope we don't again. But at the same time, conflict continues to happen. It just happens in a different way. Increasingly, civilians are targeted, intentionally or otherwise. Increasingly, the conflict is more localized, which makes it easier, I suppose, for the international community not to act until sometimes great wrongs have been perpetrated. And also, of course, it wanted to emphasize that women continue to be excluded from participation in the peace processes and in the outworkings of those peace processes, which we know from experience can spin on for several decades. It isn't just sign a piece of paper and you're done. So what is the focus of 1325? Like I say, it focuses on two things: the disproportionate impact of violent conflict and war on women and girls, and the crucial role that women should and already do play in conflict prevention and peace building. So we're going to break these into two just briefly. The first part, that conflict has a disproportionate impact on women and girls, seems a little counterintuitive. People often picture conflict as being only involving the people who are doing the fighting. And of course, women and girls increasingly are doing fighting as well, but conflict impacts far more than just the people who are actively involved in the fighting. It impacts entire communities, and it impacts families. And of course, women and girls have often been victims of violence perpetrated by warring sides for the purposes of, I suppose, decimating their community morally. And this also involves things like sexual violence meted out by invading armies and things like this. And this has been documented for centuries. It's an uncomfortable reality. And also, when war is going on, very often civil society is in such a state that people can't safely go to police, or perhaps there are no police forces operating. And so they have nobody to report anything like this to, and that increases the likelihood of it happening. And so in many ways, women are more likely to be impacted by violence, both inside of and outside of war, and indeed in the processes where peace is being built. Where violence continues, it often continues within the home, within small communities. So the second part of this focuses on the role women should and already do play in conflict prevention and peace building. This is a topic we're going to pick up in the next lecture, where we're going to talk about the role of women here locally in Northern Ireland in building peace over a period of decades, and the work that was done long before we had a peace agreement here by women, which is often forgotten about or barely mentioned in history books. And it's very important that we remember this, but also that we learn lessons from it. What is it that those women could do that really needs to be done on a bigger scale, or done valued more for what it has brought into communities? We know that women have been vital at doing the work on the ground. They may not be the ones in the press photographs. They may not be the ones with their names on the peace declarations, but they are often the ones doing the work to make peace actually happen in communities. And UN 1325 says that the peace has to be sustainable, more than just signatures to peace agreements. And studies have shown again and again internationally that the more women are involved in the peace negotiations and in the peacemaking process, where they set out whatever the equivalent of, I suppose, the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement in any other given conflict situation, the more women involved in writing that document and in putting it together, the longer the peace lasts. And the more women, as the number of women increases, the length of the peace and the stability of the peace increases. This is more than a coincidence. This is because women are reflecting issues and concerns in the peace agreement that oftentimes get overlooked by the main players in the actual conflict. And some of this we can see locally, and we'll explore more next time, but it includes things like including what they often call bread and butter issues, which are the everyday concerns that make people more likely to slide into conflict. And the prioritization of those issues might not seem like an issue for a peace agreement, but it very much is if it goes towards prevention, which of course is one of the pillars of 1325. So here we come to the 4 pillars. And I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here, but I will explain what each of them mean and why they are in there. So the first is participation. And this is calling for increased participation of women at all levels of decision making, not just in peacemaking, but at all levels in general. And this includes women in roles in domestic government, in international agencies like the United Nations, and beyond. It also includes women in things like police forces. So the police forces become perhaps less hostile to those local issues, things like sexual violence, that women need to feel safe reporting to the police. It includes women in judicial roles, for example, again, to make the judiciary reflect more the issues that women are bringing to it. Participation is very important, not just for tokenism. It isn't just a number of women. It's about reflecting the issues that I was speaking about earlier, and making sure that those are prioritized, as well as issues perhaps deemed to be most important by the actors in the actual conflict. We've seen again and again that the people involved in the conflict will have certain priorities. The people not involved but heavily impacted might have other priorities. So participation allows those issues to be heard early on and included in the peace agreement. The next pillar is protection. And this focuses specifically on the protection of women and girls from sexual and gender-based violence, including in emergency and humanitarian situations such as refugee camps. And one of the great tragedies of, for example, the peace building process in the former Yugoslavia, after their conflict was ending, it became clear that there were United Nations personnel who were deliberately involved in trafficking women into the area to be exploited by some of the United Nations personnel. And that is really an eye-opening and shocking piece of information. It goes to show that exploitation is not something that is just done by people who we immediately associate with bad organizations. Exploitation can happen by almost anybody at any time. And protecting women and girls from that, and indeed boys, has to be a priority, because in situations where, like I said, normal society and normal reporting structures have broken down, it is even easier to exploit people in this way. And exploitation obviously has to be a priority, or the prevention of exploitation has to be a priority for the safety of the general community. And of course, the people who are most victimized by this are not in any way involved in the conflict themselves. And the next pillar is prevention. And this goes back to those women going to The Hague in 1914 to ask the world leaders to please try to avoid an international conflict. It believes that improving intervention strategies in the prevention for violence against women, including by prosecuting those responsible for violations of international law, strengthening women's rights under national law, and supporting local women's peace initiatives and conflict resolution processes will help to prevent international conflict. So, like I said, one of the reasons those women weren't taken seriously when they went to The Hague in 1914 was because women in general weren't taken seriously at that time. And these women were maybe perhaps respected within their own communities, but on an international stage, their voices did not count at the same weight as a man's voice would have counted. And for that reason, everything that we can do domestically to strengthen women's participation, to strengthen the weight that their voices hold, and to ensure that their rights are respected under national law will increase the weight with which their voices are heard internationally. Of course, this doesn't imply that every woman ever has been a voice for peace and never ever involved in any kind of conflict. Not even slightly are we saying that. It's just that when these on the ground peace movements start, they overwhelmingly tend to be started by women. We'll explore that more in the next lecture. The final pillar is called relief and recovery. And this is calling for advancement of relief and recovery measures to address international crises through a gendered lens. What does that mean? It means that when there is an international crisis and we're looking at alleviating the impact of that, helping our people locally, making sure that they have their urgent needs met and the needs beyond that met for safety, that women's voices are included in that. So, for example, it includes making sure that when there is a refugee camp, that refugee camp is run by reliable, trustworthy people who will not be exploiting them, for example, or trafficking them. It means making sure that their needs beyond food and shelter are met, including the right to an education, the right to, access to things that women might think of before men would, like, say, period products. And all of these things have to be done through a gendered lens. And this is something we talked about in the first lecture. What does it mean to look at things through a gendered lens? It doesn't mean putting women's needs above men's. It means considering both together. And by doing that, we're much more likely to have a holistic approach that meets the needs of everybody and not just the needs of those with the most weight behind their voices. So the next question is, what about Northern Ireland? What does this mean for Northern Ireland and our conflict and our peace building efforts ever since the conflict has officially ended? So women have been absolutely vital to making peace here and to peace building in the period before and after peace was agreed. This is something that is not celebrated and recognised enough, not just for the sake of those women who deserve to have their names remembered and their contributions honoured, but also for the work that they have done. It needs to be prioritised, it needs to continue. And that's why we still have peace building going on 20 years later, because perhaps sometimes we lose that on the ground, community-based peace building work that women were doing decades before we had a peace agreement, by not prioritising the right things. So one of the things that we try to do in our work here at WRDA is to focus on honouring and celebrating the work that those women have done and to learn the principles of what they were doing and carry it on. It's work that the women's centres did a huge part of and continue to do. And by prioritising that work and in those settings, in those community-based settings, we can see our way out of the ongoing peace process. We also need commitment to remembering that, and like I said, and continuing the tradition, because we need to be building the next generation of peace builders who in turn can build the next generation after that. A conflict like our own, which took place over 30 years, but had roots going back centuries, doesn't end with the signing of a peace declaration, as we know. But there's no reason to believe that we won't continue to need those skills into the future. Now, UN 1325 does not officially apply here because this is not officially recognised, at least by the British government, as having been a conflict. Despite that, we do our best to work to embody the principles of 1325 in what we are doing. It's something that the women's movement here, you can see a little snapshot here of an International Women's Day celebration, where we often focus in messaging on things like the role that women have played in peace here and internationally. And there are some amazing examples of international work informed by 1325 that have really brought lasting peace to areas where there was ongoing civil conflict over a period of decades. So if it can work there, it can work here. What we are trying to do is encourage institutions to embody the principles of 1325, even if the letter of the law is not there, we can still work to embody the spirit. And that's what we try to do in all of our peace building work. So thank you very much for your time. In our next Good Relations lecture, we're going to look at the role of women in peace building here in Northern Ireland. We're going to bring it more local. And I'm hoping that these are useful. If you are watching these and you have questions, please do put questions and comments below this, and we will answer those in upcoming lectures. We've got at least 2 more to come in the new year. So thank you very much for your time, and hopefully you'll join us again for lecture number 3. Thank you.